My name's Brendan Doherty. I have a company called Big and Chewy. It's not a cookie company. It's about backing entrepreneurs who are solving the biggest, chewiest problems in the world and helping them do it more profitably. One of my most recent projects has been with Forbes and heading up and creating a division called Forbes Impact, which is all about how we align our values with our capital. So obviously because it's Forbes, it's a lot of content, it's a whole community that I've created. And I'm really excited about some of the folks that we have here today. So Asa Raskin is the co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology. We've all met Rick Ridgeway already, VP of Public Engagement at Patagonia. We have Greg Medcraft, the director of the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs at the OECD. And then John Edelman, to his right, Managing Director of Global Engagement and Corporate Responsibility at Edelman. And then Lynn Paine, who's a professor of business administration at Harvard Business School. Welcome to y'all. Okay, I'd like to start. Who here knows who Chris Hughes is? Okay, who is Chris? Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit about his recent essay that he wrote? Yeah. So, yeah, powerful essay, right? It came out yesterday. A guy who was a co-founder back in the dorm rooms with Mark of Facebook, and then also profited heavily from the rise of Facebook, wrote an essay that basically said that Facebook had, as exactly as you said, Mark had the best intentions, but that it was the growth of that company had put a staggering amount of power in the hands of one person. And he went on to say, more so than virtually anyone else in the private sector or in government. Because when you add up the value of Facebook, which today is about $500 billion, that's about the GDP of the 50 lowest countries on the GDP scale. So, you know, it goes without saying that someone like Mark Zuckerberg, in this case, you know, getting really publicly and directly called out by someone who started his company with him about this idea of consolidating power into one individual who then makes decisions that affect, you know, all of our lives. I mean, I've broken up with Facebook probably 4 times already, so I'm still broken up. I'm still sticking with it. So I just want to start there, and I think what we're going to do, if it's all right with you, is treat this a little less like a panel and more like we're a family in a living room. If it was my family, it would there'd be a lot of emotional baggage that would also come with this. But in this case, I think we're coming all with some pretty expert views, but also some personal views. And I think that's what I'd love to have come out of this is, you know, ethics is at its most basic is deeply human and deeply personal. So bringing some of that, but I also want to encourage folks to have a bit more of an interactive conversation is the point as well. So I want to start by saying that I think today it's no longer acceptable, let's say, to be an oil baron by day and a philanthropist by night. There's a lot of great institutions that have been built on that premise, on that theory, but it's one that's becoming increasingly dated. And yet, we're still trying to figure out how to, as you would say, Lynn, how to have ethics pay, and whether ethics does pay or whether it varies, or whether ethics should be part of the conversation. Clearly here we think it should be. But in other places, you know, some folks subscribe to the Milton Friedman version of capitalism, which we've subscribed to for decades. So I want to start with this idea of a philanthropist by night and an oil baron by day and ask you, you know, does ethics pay today? Rick, you talked about it, it does. But are there times when it doesn't? And what do we do in those moments when it doesn't? Because I think part of it is just being honest about it. And jump in, who'd ever like to start?
I mean, just imagine actually, to go to the human side of things, what it must feel like to be Mark Zuckerberg. Like your entire, and this I think gets to some of the heart of like the problem with the framing of ethics, because ethics is in some ways an unfortunately weak word because it's defined up here. I think every time you hear ethics, you should just replace it in your head with the actual negative impacts of what you're doing, right? Because otherwise everyone will just talk about, yeah, of course I'm ethical. So I think there's like an impact washing or an ethics washing that you see as the next step. But imagine being Mark Zuckerberg for a second. Your entire self-worth is built up out of this thing that you've created, a story you've told yourself about it being a great thing for the world, we're connecting people. And now you have a legal responsibility, a legal duty, a fiduciary duty to lie to yourself. Right? That's the place that he's in. So let's just continue on.
If we could just go back to that interesting observation about replacing the word ethics. You know, that's a word, I've been in the field of business ethics for 35 years now. And probably for the first 20 years, you couldn't even use the word because in those early years, it was, if I said I worked in business ethics, the first thing I heard was a quip back, oh, isn't that an oxymoron? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? So it was sort of a joke. And even in the early 90s, I recall getting an invitation from a large financial services institution to come to speak to the executive team about my research, which at the time was on ethics in organizations. And the request came to me with a condition. And the condition was, we'd love to have you come to talk about your research, but we don't want you to use the word ethics. So I thought that was interesting. I said, well, why not? And the answer was, well, it makes people uncomfortable. So I thought that was an interesting observation because these were people who were moving billions of dollars around the world every day and in some ways masters of the universe, but uncomfortable with this idea of ethics. So I think the word today is much more accepted, but I still think it creates unease. And that was one reason I even suggested to Father Philip that maybe there shouldn't even be a school of ethics, maybe there should be a school of sustainability or a school of something, because ethics is a component here. Maybe that's not the best way to position it, but it is a difficult word, and I think you have also, I don't want to hog the microphone here, but just the last point you made about once you become an executive and you have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders and to your company, it becomes much more complicated to begin to think about how do these different obligations fit with one another, because it's not a question really of right versus wrong. It's a question often of right versus right. I've got responsibilities to multiple parties, so how then do I have the imagination and the courage and the analytical skills to forge a pathway through these obligations that satisfies them all. So it's a very different kind of, quote, logic than I sometimes think we think when we read the newspaper and we read, oh, look what happened. They didn't know right from wrong.
I come at this from a... You can hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. I come at this from probably a different perspective. So I was 30 years an investment banker, and I was 10 years on Wall Street. And then I crossed the Rubicon to become the chairman of the SEC in Australia and head of the world's securities regulators for a number of years. So it's quite interesting going from, if you want, a key part of business to then regulating and thinking about trust in business, which is really what I think about. And I think it actually... You know, when I was on Wall Street, I never heard the word ethics, actually. It's become more common nowadays, I think. But I do think the world has changed quite dramatically, because I do think trust now is the key word. And what you realise is today, you do hear the word trust and values. And I think the reason for that is, in fact, the social licence, because... Basically, I think with the 24-hour media and social media, basically the social license is empowered. And the community actually now, I think, is almost more powerful than governments in terms of really shaping business behaviour. Because if you don't actually listen to what social media is telling you about your social license, you may not have customers, you may not actually have workers, you may not have investors. So the world has changed. So I think And what's also, I think, really important, if you want to get down to it, trust is actually really good for business, right? If it's actually about long-term value, and you talked about yourselves as a company, there are many companies like you that, where companies that actually inspire trust and loyalty, according to OECD studies, we published a study 3 years ago, and we're just updating it. There is a strong correlation between those businesses and returns on equity and investment. So it's actually good for business. So, I do think that, today more than ever, I think there is a real demand by businesses to actually understand how they get the community to trust them. And ethics and values are an essential part of it.
And I think part of it is because technology has allowed us to look further behind the business, right? Like, so the conversation, trust me, we're the brand.
There's nowhere to hide anymore.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, when I was chairman of ASIC, so much of the intelligence that would come to us for enforcement really came from whistleblowers in the community because they're empowered.
Yeah. John, I saw that that Edelman put out a trust barometer at one point, which I thought was pretty cool and pretty interesting. And just given your background in communication and how in some countries like ours, where Twitter and can be diplomacy by Twitter or by hashtag, and where trust is a real central issue. Can you talk a little bit about how you see this, for instance, the trust barometer and what role it plays, but then more broadly, trust in communications?
Okay, well, the trust barometer has been around 19 years, and for the past years, it's talked about measuring trust across business and government. And what the big news this year is that trust in business, trust as your employer, the employer is the most trusted of all the other organizations that the trust is benchmarked against, which is really significant. It's the first time ever in 19 years where the employer is the most trusted to do the right thing, to build a better community and to build a better future. And that's a change where, and they're looking to business to take a lead in trying to take action on societal issues. So that is a real opportunity, and the whole opportunity of trust is trust, talking about your license to operate. One of the prep questions was, what is about CSR and sustainability, and what is it all about? And it's moved from a must-have, and it's even more, it's your license to operate, operating as a responsible business, taking into account your environmental impacts, your social impacts, your community impacts, your supply chain impacts. All these have magnified. So it's not, you just can't be about making the money. You have to be about all these other stakeholders that all influence your perceptions, what you're all about, what you're doing, and they can change. Who would have thought things happening? People, major communication consulting companies, because of employees who are saying, we don't like what you're doing in terms of some of the policies. People are pulling back from government contracts, as an example, because the employees are very upset about some of the policies or whatever. But the point is that it's the employees who are very active as well too. So it's all these stakeholders, and it's even more the employees. That's an expectation that you're doing these things proactively instead of being asked to do it. They want you to lead in that respect.
So here's, I think, the bug in this line of thinking, which is that, so human-centered design. What is the problem? Like, human-centered design, like all of our companies use it, and yet it still got us into this complete mess. And it's because when you put humans at the center, you're putting human bugs at the center. There's the philosophy of, like, we're just giving people what they want, this license to operate, right? But when we are trying, like, how do our companies, especially Silicon Valley companies, like, how do we monetize? We monetize based on engagement. So that is the ability to grab your attention. The biggest challenge moving forward, I think the biggest philosophical challenge moving forward, is being able to distinguish the difference between what is effective versus what is right. The difference between what people want versus what people can't help but look at, right? Like, we can't help but look at a car crash when we drive by it. Like, our physiology turns our heads when we look at it, And it, of course, makes more car crashes. So imagine now there's an AI algorithm. It's like, oh, I guess people love car crashes. I'm going to show them more car crashes, which means, of course, you're going to live in a world of car crashes. So let me give like some really specific examples, because I sit on panels with like the people that run ethics for, say, Google, and they talk about these lofty goals, but then I ask like, okay, but you know that your algorithms on YouTube showed Alex Jones's videos 15 billion times. They recommended his videos 15 billion times. Why? Because it was so engaging. Netflix just put out a show called 13 Reasons Why, which glorifies suicide. We know from media ethics that you do not publish methods of suicide because it quite literally causes people to kill themselves. Then after 13 Reasons came out, indeed, suicides spiked. There's something like 30% in that month. And you know what Reed's response was? But it's really engaging content. People don't have to watch it. So, when I think that the two archetypal stories that we're living through right now are this. One, be careful what you wish for, because you're going to get it. And two, the creators losing control of their creations. So, some examples, right? Like if I'm trying to grab your attention, one way that I might do that is just like ping you a lot, but that's a lot of work to just change your behavior. Much easier would be for me to change your values, right? Change how you make choices. It's not enough for me to just get your attention. I need to addict you to needing attention. So how might an AI figure this out, or a social system might figure this out? Well, if I could undermine your sense of self-esteem, that would certainly get you addicted to needing attention. How might I do that? Oh, how about if I gave you proof every single day that people liked you more if you just looked different than you actually do? Oh yeah, that's a Snapchat filter. And 55% of plastic surgeons now in the US report having seen patients that come in asking to look like their Snapchat filter. So it's starting to modify people's fundamental identities. Social media, right? How about if I give you proof, if I want to undermine your self-esteem, every single day that people liked you more if you were living a life that wasn't actually yours? Right? Then, everyone knows with social media that that you're seeing a highlight reel of other people's lives, and that creates this comparison sadness. But I think it's a much deeper thing to realize there's a disparity between the life that you think you're living on the outside and on the inside. That's what leads to depression. And indeed, we saw that for women, suicide rate and depression rates are sort of holding steady up until around 2013 as social media started to get around, and it's climbed from around 17% to 19% in 2013 to 2017 when it was 29%, right? And then look forward just a little bit further. You guys started to play with the Gmail autocomplete feature. It's actually pretty good. It's starting to like write a little bit in my voice, and I find myself hitting tab more often. What happens in just another couple of years, say 2, 3, when you start getting analytics that shows that, hey, people like you more, your business is more effective, you're doing better and getting more responses if you hit tab. If only your personality was different, just a little, than it actually is, right? And then you start to outsource your personality to the machines, which means you're like, oh, if I'm writing something difficult, I'm having a difficult conversation, I'm just gonna hit tab. I don't have to deal with like the whole empathy thing in person because the computer's already doing a better job with me. And then we start to diminish ourselves even more. And when we think about just like the ethics of like the top down, we miss all of these downstream effects. And I think those are the things we should be like laser focused on. Otherwise we sort of get lost in this like, oh, it's trust, oh, it's this thing.
Rick, I want to jump in with you, Rick. This Patagonia has obviously been around for a lot of different ups and downs, a lot of different technologies, manufacturing, social, that have ridden the wave of. And I think timing, we live in a moment, obviously, where technology grows at an exponential rate, but our policies generally crawl. But also, I think there's this growing sense that many of the issues that we face today, where we used to say, like, we're affecting the next generation, now we're affecting actually generations that are here today, right? It's no longer a future problem, it's a now problem. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this idea of how should businesses change? Some say it's evolutionary, supply chains are complicated, incremental is the best approach, and some of that's actually true. But on the other hand, there's real fierce urgency around some challenges we face. So how do you see this timing question?
Yeah, I've been listening to the panelists, trying to think, oh, how can I tell a story or add value here to this topic of how to encourage companies to act more ethically. And, you know, to Lynn's point, we need to probably define ethics too. And so let me just, there's a lot of ways to do that, but let's just, for argument's sake, define it as, and scope it, I should say, to how you get companies to operate more responsibly through their operations and their supply chains to reduce their impact on the planet and increase their social justice. Okay, let's call that ethics for this sake
Let's call that Patagonia.
Well,
Yeah.
for the sake of my story. So let me tell you a positive story of something that we've actually pulled off. Well, we haven't pulled it off yet, but we're getting there. and it's been a hard task. But 10 years ago, we challenged ourselves to convince the apparel and footwear industry to align into a coalition to build tools to measure their environmental impact through their entire value chain, to measure their commitment to social justice through their entire value chain, and then eventually, when we achieved trustworthy data, to go public with it, with the theory that would unleash all kinds of drivers in the ecosystem to incentivize everybody to decrease their environmental impact and increase their social justice. So that would be an ethical outcome. That would increase the ethics of business globally, at least in these two sectors. So we did a keto move of convincing Walmart to partner with us. And then I worked with them to shape up what this would look like. And then we had the CEOs of Walmart and Patagonia send out a letter to a dozen other companies. And we put the two logos side by side on the letterhead because the CEOs later told me, you know, when you get a letter with Walmart and Patagonia next to each other, it's so bizarre that you got to read it. And we invited them to come in and partner with us. And it worked. We got, you know, a dozen companies to join. And we told the CEOs, listen, we don't want you guys to show up because we can't depend on you to always show up. We want you to appoint your sustainability leaders to come. And they did. So that was 10 years ago. Now today, we have 275 companies in the group. Collectively, they represent a little over half of all production for clothing and footwear on planet Earth. That means half of you in the room here have something you're wearing on your body or your feet made by this group. We've achieved the 1.0 version of our tools, and some of the tools are a little more developed than that. We just stood up, we closed a deal 3 days ago to create a software company that the coalition owns to actually continue to develop the software. And here was the really interesting thing. We got everybody to sign up for this, you know, telling them that, you know, as soon as we get to trustworthy data, we're going to go public with this. And they didn't know what they were signing up for. That was sort of the strategy. Because transparency is the ultimate achievement in this. That once we verify the data using technology, using AI and other things, I've talked to some people here about that already, then when you go transparent with that data, it's going to unleash a huge amount of force, both stick and carrot, as I said before, to reduce environmental impact and increase social justice. That's the theory of change. And we're just about 18 months away from going transparent. And then, you know, on transparency, to me, that trustworthy data, you know, facts that you can actually trust is essential. But when you go transparent with that, that will unleash ethical behavior across business. And there's business value in that. Lynn and I were talking about this at lunch. And that's the promise to actually scale this. Again, to quote Mark Twain, as the previous panel did, Mark Twain reminds us that, you know, the great thing about telling the truth is that you don't always have to keep remembering what you said.
Let me add on my function, corporate social responsibility, Edelman, we didn't have a function up until 9 years ago. And so the journey of what any company can do, my advice would be start doing it, because the world has changed and the expectations are higher. So we started doing basic things like having an environmental policy, tracking our greenhouse gases, and then you build the success, but more importantly, companies have to take a step. But the second thing is what you're sharing. There's a sector-specific solution that's going on everywhere in the world of sustainability. There's the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. They're all working on, everybody's environmental impact is different according to what you're all about. So as a sector, you have a collective voice to make positive change. And the way things are evolving, there's 77 disclosure standards for the financial standards. There's so each sector has to work together. So you have to take steps going forward, but then the next piece of advice is work across your sector, because then you are working as a collective voice, because the stakeholders have that expectation. If you're a collective voice, you want to compete on the solutions, not do you have an environmental policy, or do you track your greenhouse gas emissions, or do you have a human rights policy. You want to compete on the ideas and the solutions, not the larger things which make it happen. So that's why a collective impact is very powerful in making change happen and being transparent about it.
One of the things too, go ahead.
Can I just add, I should mention, at the OECD, in this business conduct area, there's 3 key areas I think that are important that we do around the world. One is in anti-corruption, which we have the Anti-Corruption Convention where we work all over the world, which is a big problem in terms of trust. Secondly, there's clearly corporate governance, where we have the principles of corporate governance, where it's a big issue of getting companies to good. But the third area is a little bit to what you were just talking about, is responsible business conduct in supply chains. And here, in fact, we actually have the convention that's signed by 48, 50 countries that actually has a standard. There is a standard for supply chain due diligence conduct. In fact, we have one, I think you may be involved in our footwear and garment coalition around the world. So, but we have that in extractive industries, in mineral supply, and it's a little bit to the last comment you were saying, is that, say, mineral supply, now the London Metals Exchange requires that if you deliver metals to the metals exchange, you've actually got to comply with the OECD due diligence standard, so that in fact, that the metals haven't been involved using child labour in the supply chain, for example, or whatever. So, I mean, there are standards out there. A lot of the time, people just don't even know about them, right? And also, one of the things we're working on there is taking across those sectors is using blockchain, for example, in supply chains, because to the point, getting more transparency and better data is really important. So there is a lot happening, I guess, on the policy side.
I hate playing this role, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to throw a monkey wrench into this.
This is the family living room. We're back in the family living room. This is good. That's what I'm talking about. Okay.
So if I listen to all these comments, I would say, gee, we're in great shape. Let's go home. Let's go to have a party right now. We don't need to worry about this. But a couple of weeks ago, I was out in San Francisco for a public discussion of Pacific Gas and Electric. And that is a company that you may know is one of the largest utilities providers in the US, and they declared bankruptcy in January because of liabilities, $1,700 billion in liabilities related to wildfires in California. It's being called the first climate-related bankruptcy because the intensity of the wildfires has increased, the frequency has increased, but the company's business model and operating practices haven't really kept up with that change. And I think that we actually have some pretty serious problems, and that while all these things that we're talking about, these standards and so on, they're really good and we should do them, my sense is there's a lot of incremental efforts, and what we really need are some really significant investments in innovation that will produce really sustainable business models. And I'm talking serious money now, not just incremental change. In our research, we've talked to business executives about, well, this is great, your supply chain stuff, and we're glad you're adhering to this code of conduct, but why aren't you putting any money into real R&D, real innovation? And the answer that often comes back, now some are doing it, and we can talk about what's the difference between these groups, but one of the answers that comes back is that my shareholders won't let me. That it's capital markets pressures. And if you look at McKinsey's work, you see that boards of directors are a real source of pressure, capital markets pressure. And when Rick and I were talking, I said, hey, Rick, if you were a public company, could you do all these things? Probably not a lot of them. So a real question is there are obstacles here, there are some pressures, and these things, while they're really great, are they really enough to address the serious problems? That's the question I would raise.
Yeah.
Just one thing, Lynn, that, I just described this coalition we put together at Patagonia, but at our company, we're striving to, as you know from my previous talk, do a lot more than just that, because we have to, because there's not enough time to depend just on coalition building of a whole industry to get there. You have to lead in other ways. And just to frame it at the highest level at our company, which again is a little bit of a downer on the day, is that, people often talk about the KPIs of your business. And at our company, we consider the real KPIs to be the indicators of the health of our planet. It's living health. It's the parts per million in the atmosphere, the acidification of the ocean, the deforestation of our forests, the expansion and desertification of our wetlands. Probably the biggest one of all, the continued extinction of the species of wildlife on this planet. Those are our key performance indicators, and everybody in the room knows they're tanking. So every day that we come to work, we remind ourselves that we're not doing enough, that we got to be bolder, that we've got to take even more aggressive and risky action perhaps, but there's not a lot of time left.
One of the things that...
Sorry, can I just comment to that? Sorry, just from having regulated companies around the world, what you say is absolutely true, and investors, because one of the things when I talk to investors around the world is they go, yes, we're very much focused on ESG risks, and it's a big concern for us now. But actually when so at the top levels, we go to BlackRock, whatever, yes, we're with it. It's part of long-term value. But when you actually talk to companies, and they talked about how they've discussed with the analysts from BlackRock, they actually go, yeah, that's current corporate thing. Now, how are you going to make your next quarter's results? And you're quite right. There's a hell of a lot of what I call, you've got greenwashing. Well, I think you've got a lot of sustainability washing going on at the moment, which is, at the end of the day, it's actually about the talk and not about action. So I do think it's a very good issue to call out, because it is something I have been hearing a lot more, but it depends where you have the discussion. If you have the discussion up here, people are talking about, but as we know with culture, sometimes at the top it doesn't flow to the middle and it can disappear by the bottom. So it's a very good point.
It's very much related to the incentive system that's put in place in the firms, and what the portfolio managers are provided, the incentives are very different.
I think one thing that's also come up is this idea of purists versus pragmatists. And, as you were talking, Rick, about, doing something with Walmart, for instance, Gene and I were talking a little bit ago about, the most recent criminal justice reform in the United States passed in December of 2018. And that was basically one of the first bipartisan pieces of major legislation that happened in our country in a couple years. And part of what happened behind the scenes was that you had one of the most unlikely bedfellows. You had Van Jones, scion of the liberal criminal justice reform advocacy, partnering with a guy named Mark Holden. Does anyone know who Mark is? Mark's the global general counsel for Koch Industries. Koch Industries was the group that brought down Van when he was appointed to be the Green Czar for the Obama White House. It was Americans for Prosperity that really funded the campaign that brought Van down. And Van and Mark, in baby steps, ultimately became incredibly intertwined and working collaboratively to pass criminal justice reform. And I think it's these kinds of very unlikely bedfellows that, that we really need to cultivate. It's almost like Kellyanne Conway and her husband, right? I mean, she's deep in the administration. He's one of the most vocal critics of Trump, and they go home and have dinner, right? I mean, we need to learn from these things and figure out how to navigate those tricky places, but where we overlap. Okay, we're going to do I think we probably have 5 minutes, yeah. This is part of the spiciness of the panel I talked about earlier. So I'm going to say a sentence that y'all are going to finish, and we're going to start with you. Okay. You can take 10 minutes now. One thing I know to be true.
There's so many ways to go from here.
Talk about being purists.
One thing I know to be true. We seem to have a whole bunch of issues, and I'm going to focus mostly on the technology side of things. That's the
It
side
has to
that
be
I know
succinct.
more.
It has to be like a punchy, succinct answer.
All right.
That I know to be true. One
That-
thing I know to be true.
That while we've been upgrading our machines, we've been downgrading our humanity.
Beautiful. Brevity is the mother of invention. And you just came up with a beautiful phrase. Rick.
One thing we know to be true is I can't figure out how to turn my mic on. One thing we know to be true is that parents listen to their kids, and most CEOs of global companies are parents.
One thing I know to be true is that inequality is growing, and unless we do something soon, we're going to have major problems. So, from my side.
One thing I know to be true, I think that sustainability has to extend to the small, medium enterprises as the large multinationals to have any impact and positive change, so we're all speaking the same language and working together on the larger issues.
I guess I take my cues from Socrates, and one thing I know to be true is that we don't know as much as we think we know.
One thing I know to be true is I'm really grateful to be here. This is such an extraordinary place to bring folks together with such weight behind it. And the other thing I know to be true is that Matt Sanders, who I don't know where he is, yeah, he's in the back, which is actually what I wanted to say, which is that Matt is one of the most quiet, calming, beautiful, heartfelt, intentional people that I know who really doesn't seek the limelight and yet is through that able to accomplish so much. So that's what I know to be true, is that Matt, you are a gift to this community. And I think I know to be true that I'm going to end this panel early. How about that? Giving you all a minute or two of your time back. Thank you.
The 2019 Humane 2.0 Forum is brought to you by Cisco Systems, CSR solutions that are accelerating global problem solving in ways that have never been attempted before, to Ulala, providing mobile blockchain solutions for the unbanked, and to Pledge Camp, the next generation of crowdfunding. A special thanks to Tonico in Vatican City for